They didn't look at me once. That's the part I keep coming back to. Nora Strand's team had 3 SUVs, a drone, 2 surveyors with tripods, and a site manager named Brett Kohler who wore a hard hat like a crown. They had staked out a half-mile of Callum Valley by 8 in the morning, and when I pulled my truck up to the fence line to check the allotment gate, the way I do every Tuesday, not one of them looked up from their tablets. I didn't mind. I got out, checked the padlock, walked the fence post that had been leaning since February. Iris was in the passenger seat eating a biscuit, her sketchbook open on her knees, the way it always is. She'd drawn the red bluffs that morning before school, got the color exactly right, which still amazes me, and she'd propped it on the dashboard to dry. That's when Brett Kohler noticed us. He walked over like a man who owns wherever his boots are standing. He was already talking before he reached the truck. "This is a closed site. You need to back out the way you came." He glanced at the drawing on the dashboard and said, without lowering his voice, "That the best art school your dad can afford, sweetheart." Iris didn't answer. She just closed her sketchbook. Shh. I looked at Brett Kohler the way my father taught me to look at a man who has mistaken loudness for authority, I said. "I'll be out of your way in 5 minutes. I'm just checking the gate." "You're checking it from the other side of the county road," he said. "Starting now." Across the site, Nora Strand glanced up from her tablet for exactly 2 seconds. She made a small motion with her hand, "Move along," and went back to her screen. That was the full extent of it. One of her surveyors actually laughed. I got back in the truck. Iris was quiet. We drove the 2 miles back to our place without saying much. And when I parked, she looked at me, with those careful eyes she had, said, "Why didn't you tell them?" "Tell them what?" I said. She shook her head like I was being dense on purpose. Maybe I was. The truth is, I hadn't told anyone in a long time. Not since my wife Carol died 4 years back. Not since I stopped driving into Flagstaff for meetings I didn't need, and started spending my mornings checking fence lines and my evenings helping Iris with long division. People see an old pickup and a man with calloused hands, and they make up their mind. I stopped correcting them. It's quieter that way. My family has held the water rights to this valley since my grandfather drove a wagon out of Oklahoma in 1937. Not a theory, not a claim, a deed. The Callum Valley Consolidated Water Rights Instrument, signed, re-recorded, current. Through this year, every spring and aquifer from the North Rim to the Old Sutter Wash. 3 generations of my family are buried on this land. My grandfather dug the first well by hand. My father mapped every spring on a piece of butcher paper that still hangs in our kitchen. When the developers started circling 20 years ago, Carol was the one who sat with the county attorney and made sure every instrument was airtight. She said, "Ray, water is the one thing the desert never stops needing." She was right about most things. I did not follow Nora Strand's project closely. I knew the resort proposal was moving. There'd been a notice in the county paper and a public meeting I hadn't attended. But I assumed, the way you assume things you maybe shouldn't, that someone in her organization had done a title search, that someone had found my name and would eventually drive up our road with a proposal. No one drove up our road. 3 days after Brett Kohler told me to move my truck, I was repairing the water line to the lower trough when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, Phoenix area code. I let it ring, then it rang again. Then a third time, it was Nora Strand. Her voice was different from what I'd heard across the site. Measured, but with something tight underneath it. The way a person sounds when they've just learned the floor isn't where they thought it was. "Mr. Callum," she said, "I need to speak with you. Today, possible." I told her she knew where I lived. It was on the deed. She came alone, which I respected. No Brett Kohler, no tablets, no drone. Just her car and the dust it kicked up on our road. Iris was at school. I was on the porch with a cup of coffee when she pulled in, and I poured a second cup because that's what you do. She sat across from me at the porch table and put a folder down without opening it. I already knew what was in it. Her title attorney had done the search they should have done 6 months ago, and every water rights instrument in Callum Valley, every spring, every well, every aquifer tap, traced back to one name, mine. "Mr. Callum," she said, "I owe you an apology." "You owe Iris one too," I said. "But we can circle back to that," she nodded. She wasn't a cruel person, I realized, just someone who moved fast in a world that rewarded moving fast. and who had made the mistake of assuming that a man with a dusty truck had nothing to say worth hearing. She told me her groundbreaking was in 8 days. She told me her investors had committed $43 million. She told me her project attorney had somehow missed the consolidated instrument, and that she had personally placed Brett Kohler on administrative leave that afternoon. I listened to all of it. Then she said, "I'd like to discuss acquisition or a long-term rights agreement, whatever terms work for you." She finally opened the folder. There were numbers on the first page that would have impressed a younger version of me. I didn't look at the numbers long. I said, "I'm not interested in selling." She was quiet for a moment. "A long-term agreement then, a lease on the water access. Your terms, Mr. Callum." I thought about Carol's butcher paper map on the kitchen wall. I thought about Iris's drawing of the red bluffs, and the way she'd closed her sketchbook quietly, without a word, because that's the kind of person she already is at 9 years old. "Here's my term," I said. "One term, not negotiable. The Sutter family, and the Arculeta family, and the 3 other ranching families in this valley have used these springs for 60 years. Their grandfathers shook hands with my grandfather. Any agreement you and I sign has to guarantee their access at the same rate they pay now, which is nothing, in perpetuity. You build your resort around that, you have a deal. You build around them, you don't." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked out at the valley, at the red bluffs and the long shadow they were already throwing across her proposed site, and I watched her calculate, not the numbers, something else. "All right," she said. She reached across the table and we shook on it. Her hand was steady. Before she got in her car, she paused and said, "How long have you held the rights?" "My grandfather filed in 1954, I said. 72 years. She stood with that for a second. "We missed that completely." "You weren't looking," I said. "You were looking at what you were going to build. That's different from looking at what's already there." She thought about that. Then she nodded and got in her car. I stood on the porch and watched the dust settle after she'd gone. When Iris got off the school bus an hour later, she came up the porch steps and dropped her backpack and looked at me. "Did someone come?" "A woman named Nora Strand," I said. "She wanted to talk about the water rights." Iris considered this. "Did you tell her?" "I told her," I said. She thought about it for another moment. The way she thinks about things, carefully, with those eyes that look just like her mother's. Then she nodded like the matter was settled, picked up her backpack, and went inside to start her homework. I stayed on the porch as the light changed on the bluffs. That hour when the red goes deep and the shadows run long, and the valley looks exactly the way my grandfather must have seen it the first morning he woke up here. The springs were still running somewhere below the north rim. The old Sutter fence line was holding. Everything was still there. Everything was still exactly what it had always been. They saw a dusty truck on a fence line. They had no idea whose water they were standing on. But they know now.